We need to talk about that $418 million proposed National Association of Realtors settlement. Now, I hope you guys caught the word proposed. This is not court approved yet. It is still in the proposed stages. We don't know if the Department of Justice is going to come in and make some more claims or some more requirements. We don't know if there's going to be further fallout, but what I can tell you in this video is what's been proposed, how it's going to affect my business. And I'll just say, I'm going to share some of the pros and cons of the National Association of Realtors, why it's important that they're, in our world, and some of the downfalls that I see. For those of you who are watching, I want to make sure you understand that the settlement covers all national brands and all National Association of Realtors members. Home Services of America, otherwise known as Berkshire Hathaway, is not included in the settlement. They're still actively litigating. Okay, I'm going to simplify this in layman's terms from a realtor's perspective about what the lawsuits are about. And there's really 2 points that are consistent through all the lawsuits. The first one is commission fixing. So they are stating that the National Association of Realtors and the brokers are all colluding and price fixing or commission fixing, meaning that there's an industry standard, whether it be 6%, 3% on either side, or 5%, that agents are coming in there and brokers are teaching their agents that this is a set commission, and that goes against the Sherman Act, and that's what they're being charged. Okay, I'll get into whether or not I agree with that, but that's one of the issues that's at play right now. Second complaint is that the buyers don't have the ability to negotiate their representations commission. So when they're purchasing a property, the buyer's agent commission is already baked in the price. And that buyer does not have the ability to negotiate the buyer's agent commission, meaning that they don't get to affect the price of the house because the commission is already set for the buyer's agent. They have no ability or capacity to negotiate that. That settlement is actually paid over a 4-year period of time. And in that settlement, there are 3 actions moving forward that they are putting in place that's going to change the way we do real estate. First item that they're proposing is that all buyer agents commissions are not included or published in the MLS. So that means that the buyers are responsible for paying for their own buyer agent commission. Second thing is that buyers need to have a buyer-broker agreement with their buyer's agent. It's actually a contract that the buyer will negotiate with their buyer's agent a commission or whatever payment they feel. It could be a per hour fee, it could be a flat fee, but they have to have an agreement set in place. And the key here is that agreement has to be set in place before the buyer's agent shows them any property. That's actually part of the settlement. Okay, the third one is that brokers are no longer required to be a part of the multiple listing services if they don't want to be. Okay, now the fun stuff. We get to talk about Audra's perspective, my opinion, and how it's going to impact my business, because I'm actually the one that are talking to the sellers and the buyers. I'm a realtor, right? So most of the people I watched on YouTube, they're either real estate investors or they're real estate agent coaches, but they're not actually the people that are on the ground having to have these very difficult conversations with the people, the consumer out there. So I think my perspective's a little bit unique. So let's talk about commissions, my favorite topic, okay? Now, let's first go back and talk about history, because a lot of you have reached out to me saying, well, why was the commission structure set up where the seller is supposed to pay for the listing agent's commission and the buyer's agent? Like, why would that even take place? In the olden days, Wild, Wild West days, before the National Association of Realtors existed, where there was no code of ethics, there was no standard business practices in real estate, a seller would go to sell their property. They would hire representation, or their listing agent, right? Representation. The buyer would go to purchase the house, but they couldn't afford their own representation. So they were forced to use the seller's representation. And boy, did they get taken advantage of, right? They got raked through the coals. They were misrepresented because that seller's representation owed no fiduciary responsibilities to that buyer's agent. Do you guys follow me on that? So lots of lawsuits later where the buyers are having fits because they're not being properly represented. The consumer is being taken advantage of. The lowly cannot compete with the rich homeowners, right? So that's why this commission structure was established. So the seller would bake in a commission, and that commission was not because they're trying to incentivize the buyer's agent to sell their house. It was mainly for protection for them, that they had, meaning the buyer had representation during the process. They weren't being taken advantage of. And if that buyer had any issues with the process, that buyer can go sue their own buyer's agent, not the seller. Hope you guys followed that. So the big question is, okay, we understand the seller is paying the buyer's agent directly, but why was the seller never paying the buyer directly and let the buyer pay the agent's commission? That's really the question. And, from my understanding, don't quote me on this, the main reason why they did it that way back in the day is because some of them didn't have escrow companies. We didn't have wire transfers. So the big issue was, hey, if the seller pays the buyer and the buyer is not paying the buyer's agent, then the buyer's agent doesn't have compensation, and therefore that's also not protecting the seller, because we need to make sure that buyer's agent is paid so that the buyer does have the proper representation through the process. That's just my understanding. Okay, so here we are today. Now, what you have to understand about this commission is that they're just decoupling commission, meaning that the seller is no longer responsible for paying for the buyer's agent commission. They're decoupling it, meaning that the seller pays for their representation and the buyer pays for their representation. Okay, now this is where it gets tricky, and I haven't heard anybody talk about this yet, so I'm going to talk about it with you. In the proposed settlement, it states that the MLS can no longer publish buyer agent commissions. All right, we got that, okay? But it doesn't state anywhere, and there's going to be a little, I'm telling you, someplace in MLS where the seller can offer concession amounts, meaning dollar amounts, percentages, whatever, to the buyer, okay, to incentivize them to purchase their home. So they can do that by lowering their price, or there's going to be a concession amount in MLS. Did you guys hear me on this? Now, this is all proposed, mind you, but what's the difference between commission and concession? Tomato, okay? So a couple things can happen here. A seller can put a concession amount in MLS, and the buyer gets that concession amount, and they can decide to do whatever they want with it. They can lower the price, they can pay their buyer's agent, right? But that's really not the seller's responsibility to figure out where that money goes. That's really up to the buyer. The second thing that can happen is a buyer's agent can negotiate for their buyer some monies to cover their costs. So let's say the house is $1 million. They can say, hey, we'll buy the house for $1,020,000, and we want that 20 extra thousand to give to the buyer as a concession so they can cover my fees. Okay, they can actually write that in. Now, of course, the seller can say no, but let me tell you, if they're getting no offers and that seems like a fair price, they're more than likely going to cooperate. Okay, so call me crazy, but I just don't think it's that big of a deal. Meaning, like, you're changing commission with concession. Okay, whoop-de-doo, okay? And okay, I do think it's important that the buyers get to negotiate their own buyer agent commission, which, by the way, we're already doing that right now. Like, all the brokers have been doing this now since the beginning of the year, where the agent is having to negotiate with their buyer a certain commission structure, and they work it out. They do that right now, okay? That was a big change. We saw this settlement coming down. Has it changed the way we do business? Not necessarily. If there's any loser in this lawsuit, it's the buyer, okay? Because now they have the responsibility of having to compensate their own buyer's agent. And a lot of them are not going to know this up front. And so now, before a buyer can even go view a property, they're going to have to sign a buyer agent agreement with the buyer's agent, meaning that, oh yes, I'm the buyer's agent exclusively representing Billy Bob, okay? And now Billy Bob stuck with this agent for the duration of time that's agreed on that contract. So be very careful if you're a buyer, okay? This is even more important now to pay attention to contracts, because they're going to shove a buyer-broker agreement in front of you. There are options. There's terms. You can work with the guy for a month, or you can say, hey, I'm going to work with this buyer's agent for just this one property, which is what I would recommend doing until you feel comfortable that this buyer's agent is working with you and you feel comfortable with them, we'll just say negotiating for you and representing you in the process. I just want you to make sure you understand what I said. The buyer has to sign an agreement with the buyer's agent before they even show any property. Okay, that is what the settlement is suggesting. Okay, you know what to do. Please subscribe. Trying to get to 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Just really trying to get these videos out to the public. They need to hear it. So the whole premise behind these lawsuits / proposed settlements is that the buyer needs to have more control over the commission. Okay, we get that. But second of all, it's about transparency in our business. So even a few years ago, like the buyer had no idea that the buyer's agent was making what type of commission they were making, right? It was publicized in MLS, but it wasn't publicized anywhere else. And it wasn't a requirement that the buyer's agent had to disclose to the buyer how much money they were making on the transaction, which I think is that's kind of important. The buyer should know that. And if you notice on Zillow and Trulia and all the internet sites, they will publish the buyer's agent commission, which will probably be now changed to buyer's concession. But either way, it's a lot more transparent. The reason why this commission topic is so heated is, number one, it's a lot of money. But number two, the seller and buyer are just not seeing the value out of their agents. And that really is a reflection on us, meaning the realtor community, that we should be better educated. We should be offering more services, and it should be communicated to the consumer. I do think overall commissions are going to trend down, primarily because the buyer and the seller are finally aware that they can negotiate those commissions, okay? It's kind of always been the secret thing. And second of all, I think these sellers and buyers are getting smart. They're going to interview several different agents. And if they all offer the same thing, right, it's going to become a commoditized industry where it's going to be, okay, you guys are all offering the same thing. Who's going to do it for the least amount? So that's the other reason. Now, of course, there are special agents like myself, if I may give myself a pat in the back, that offer superior services, experience, and education, and yada, 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 which of course I'm not going to settle because I'm offering a totally different product. So I do think overall that we're going to have a different experience, but I don't think all of a sudden the real estate market's going to implode and the buyer's agent's going away. There is a need for it. I do think the settlement/lawsuit is a step in the right direction. I think it's important for the buyers to have transparency and the sellers to have transparency. I also think it's extremely important for the buyer and the seller to know that, hey, they're in the driver's seat. They get to negotiate. They get to take matters into their own hands. They get to hire agents and interview and negotiate. This is a very important decision. The ball is in their court. They do have power. I also think it's an opportunity for the National Association of Realtors and brokers to realize, wow, we're kind of exposed here. We better do a better job of protecting and educating the consumer and our agents. I think it should be more protocols in place, higher education, continuing education to make sure we're producing the best agent we can out there that deserves those commissions that we're earning. Okay, I know that was a long one. Thanks for watching. If you got any value, please subscribe to my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one.